Did Native Americans really have any rights? The native population in North America has been through some unimaginable atrocities. And as the decades and centuries have rolled on, did this get any better? That's why I wanted to explore a bit more about how land rights, property ownership, and finances worked for the Native American population in today's video. I want to talk about how the concept of the doctrine of discovery changed the lives of an entire population of Native Americans. So, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We've got some really interesting videos about history and finance, which I think you'll find very interesting. Alright, so let's get back to the doctrine of discovery and how land acquisition worked with the Native American population. You see, America prided itself on upholding property rights. I mean, it's part of the Constitution. The Constitution states that all men are equal and hold inalienable rights, including the right to private property. And so going by this law, this would have hindered or even stopped America's westward white settlement. As the original inhabitants of the land, the natives, by law, technically held rights to them. And this meant that only through legal purchases could white settlers gain territory. Essentially, this would have made the natives the richest people in the country. Now, just to set the context, this was a time when even white, German, and Irish immigrants were heavily discriminated against. So imagine the fury at the prospect of completely non-whites being the richest population. So what the American legal experts did was that they tried to look up some legal excuse to deny the natives rights to their own land. And they found their excuse in the so-called Doctrine of Discovery. This stemmed from a papal decree made centuries earlier. It stated that a Christian European nation could claim and settle any non-European land if they discovered it first. This was all to promote Christian domination and superiority. But here's the kicker. This also applied if someone else was on the land first, but their way of being on the land was inadequate according to European standards. It was heavily racist, and it viewed the native population as subpar or uncivilized. And so, based on this, in 1823, the US Supreme Court established the Doctrine of Discovery as part of federal law. And this was used to dispossess native peoples of their land. Effectively, with a simple stroke of a pen, America would displace countless natives off their land. Over time, laws would be readjusted or reinterpreted to allow for the seizure of native lands for white settlement. Sometimes the government would even ignore its own Supreme Court rulings if it was in favor of natives. For instance, in 1830, the US government passed the Indian Removal Act. In theory, this act allowed the government to pay willing natives to resettle west of the Mississippi River. But in reality, it was plain and simple ethnic cleansing, because those tribes who weren't willing to go were forcefully removed with violence. And this was despite the Supreme Court ruling it as unlawful. However, declaring something as unlawful and actually enforcing the law are two completely separate things. The US president at the time, Andrew Jackson, infamously said, "The Chief Justice, Marshall, has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Later on, many of these removed natives may have repurchased rights to their historical lands. Now, this would have been true certainly for the 5 civilized tribes who adopted the European lifestyle. These tribes developed extensive economic ties with the white settlement and had assimilated into their American settler culture. Anyhow, the lands that these tribes were resettled in were often barren and of low economic value. But even this wouldn't stop the opportunistic white settlers. Whenever it was discovered that any of these lands held too much economic value, there were grounds to seize it. This is exactly what's described in the book Killers of the Flower Moon. This book talks about the head rights of the Osage tribe members. As per the head rights, each Osage member was entitled to an equal share of their oil estate. So once the oil was flowing, this tribe was actually considerably rich. But you see, that created a massive problem. It led their white counterparts to grow jealous. And as always in the history of the United States, they wanted the land for themselves. You see, there was this thing in the system called guardianship. In this, a white person would be assigned to watch over the Osage tribe members because they were deemed incompetent. That's right, tribe members would often be deemed as incompetent or unable to manage their own finances and their money. That's why they needed a guardian. And the guardian would usually be a white settler man. And the white men would usually use their authority as guardians to forcefully marry into the Osage tribe members as well. And this is why the killings began, so that the head rights could be passed on to the killers as they were now the heads. Just as before in history, the Osage faced an uphill battle for justice, with white judges, law enforcers, and politicians refusing to investigate these kinds of killings. These kinds of tactics of violence were employed again and again to rob natives of whatever rights they had remaining to their land. This is precisely why, at the same time that the US population was growing rapidly, the native population was sinking. From 1800 to 1900, the native population decreased from 600,000 to a mere 237,000. The murder of the native population was rarely persecuted, and even if it did, the sentence was super light. The legal justice system was never on the side of the natives. However, if they took matters into their own hand and the native population resisted injustice, it actually led to the US military intervening, forcefully stopping them or removing them from their lands. Afterwards, there would be instances where there were treaties between certain native tribes and the white settler communities, and this would be treating the native tribes as if they were a separate country. It's so interesting to see the duality of the US perspective on native relations. You see, when it was convenient, they would treat them as being part of the US, subject to US laws and land ownership rights and property ownership and so on. And in other instances, they would see them as separate nations. The US military also used scorched earth tactics to force natives off their land. One of the most famous examples is that of the near extermination of the American bison. You see, the American bison was a crucial economic and food resource for native populations. So, if you remove the bisons, you remove the natives. In the 1800s, there were tens of millions of these animals roaming the Great American Plains, and by 1900, there were less than 1,000 remaining. With the native population pushed to the marginal regions in the country, it is no surprise that they remain one of the poorest demographies in the country. Even today, the effects of the historical doctrine of discovery impacts the native population. It denies them rights to property ownership and property rights in many instances. You often hear that history is written by the victors, but it's probably more accurate to say that history is omitted by the victors. That's why it's important for us to remember these facts, to know these stories. It's important and critical for us to reflect on the atrocities of the past that have led us to the present. There was another instance where the welfare of the native population was totally forgotten as their lands were sold from one superpower to another. That's right, I'm talking about the Alaska Purchase, and I made a video about that right here, so subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you next week.